As mentioned, we're going to actually start by talking about wearables below the neck, so body and wrist-worn wearables and devices for enhanced safety and communication in the workplace. So I think the main discussion here is going to focus around having thought leaders and practitioners from leading enterprises share the use cases they've been exploring and deploying within their organizations, some of the lessons they've learned, some of the challenges they've experienced, any ROI that any of them have actually been able to capture. So I think it's going to be a great, fantastic discussion here today. To introduce my fellow panelists, I'd like to first introduce to my left, this is Brian Mullen. He's Innovation Strategy Manager at the Brigham Innovation Hub, part of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Martin Lightgab, he's a Senior Research Engineer at Leidos. We've got Kelvin Sanborn. He's the Environmental Health and Safety Digital and Analytics Leader at GE. Mark Melody, EHS Manager at Caterpillar. And Joe Williams, who's Director of Technology for OBrien Construction. So great group of folks here representing a lot of different industries. So I'd ask you guys, I think it'd be fantastic to get each of you to weigh in here. I think each of you give sort of a long-form elevator pitch for sort of what's the use case for each of your organizations, highlighting sort of what you hope to accomplish, why wearables, what's your sort of organizational strategy around deploying wearables. So Brian, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so I work at Brigham and Women's Hospital, or Brigham Health. It's one of the world-leading academic medical institutions here in Boston, part of Partners Healthcare. I'm part of a team that looks at how do we bring digital innovation into the hospital, as well as how do our researchers, we're an academic medical institution, so how do our researchers move when they have an idea or discovery, how do those move forward, and generally creating a culture of acceptance of digital innovation beyond our traditional research and clinical innovation pathways. So I think for us, I'm at a node where I get to see both the researchers and the clinicians, and one's kind of doing a discovery push and the other's looking to do a problem pull of how do I use technology to solve this clinical problem or challenge I have, or others say I'm making these discoveries, or how do I use new technologies to help us do better research. So with that, we're really looking at wearables of a really unique way to start to pull in data about human behavior, clinical conditions, chronic conditions that we've never had access before, which lines up a whole host of other challenges. So we're looking both from a research standpoint, how can we use wearables to learn more about that patient? How do we research that to see how, if somebody has wearables and data, how does that change care decision, coordination of care, empower the patient to care for themselves better, things like that. And that very much overlaps with, from the clinical side, when patients are coming and saying, I have this data now because I have a with things thing or a Fitbit or whatever it is, how do we take that information and move it into clinical care practice? And wearables are the starting point for a lot of that. We're looking across the spectrum from all the things you're talking about today, including above the head and everything. It's anything digital. So how do we actually use that data in a meaningful way? How does that integrate in with our systems, especially in a heavily regulated area around HIPAA compliance and data usage and personal health records and things like that?
Okay, I'm Martin Lightgab. I'm with Leidos. We're working with NASA. It's our main customer on a human health and performance contract under KBR Wiley, a different company. At NASA, we work very tightly integrated with our customer. So we work on the space radiation analysis group, and the task for the group is to ensure that the radiation exposure of astronauts stays below established safety limits during the mission. So we have been tasked specifically to develop a personal radiation dosimeter that can be worn by astronauts on future exploration missions, so beyond the Earth, going to the Moon and Mars and other destinations. And we have worked with a commercial vendor to streamline our resources. So we essentially took a commercial off-the-shelf part and then extended it per our requirements with our vendor Myriad Technologies. And this little one right here is what's coming out of that. The architecture that we implemented has a very long battery life. We were talking 8 months. Has a display to feed information back to crew or to astronauts. And also it has a autonomous data transfer architecture where based on a preset schedule, the device connects with laptops via Bluetooth and then pushes data off and downloads it to the ground automatically without the astronauts needing to do anything. We then also follow on a more fundamental effort to extend the capabilities of a wearable device to include multiple sensors. And we were working with a large group of stakeholders at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, that range from environmental concerns to physiological measurements to going into spacecraft design and team cohesion kind of information. So we're trying to, we have been funded for FY18 for a prototype on that account, so that's what we're trying to do next. And that's it.
Thanks.
Great. I'm with the Environment, Health, and Safety function at GE, and I'm part of a team that's focused on using data, analytics, and technology to manage hazards across GE's portfolio. So largely we're focused on highly hazardous processes or finding productivity through the use of technology like wearables. Generally what our team does is we look across the data across GE, figure out where our highly hazardous processes are, what they're focused on, and then look for solutions associated with those hazards. And what our team does is we really incubate and pilot those technologies in conjunction with the various business units across GE, and we get them through pilot phase and then really to an implementable, scalable state in which we can then turn them over to the businesses to use more broadly, all focused around managing hazards inside GE, partnering with customers around how we can reduce injuries and reduce unplanned downtime out in the field. And when I think about below the neck wearable devices, I really think about them in two different categories. I would say the majority of our work is focused around one category being how we make hidden hazards more visible. So things like voltage sensing wearables or sensors that can provide real-time ergonomic feedback, things of that nature. And then the second group, I think, is around making the employee, sort of augmenting the employee, if you will, to do their job. So through things like exoskeletons and wearable versions of robotics and things of that nature. So I think our main focus is, at least on the below the neck wearables, are in those two arenas, focused specifically on highly hazardous, but also around areas of productivity and ultimately to reduce employee injuries.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Mallory. I'm an EHS manager at Caterpillar. Product Support and Logistics Division. We're about 60 locations, about 15,000 employees, so pretty large division. We started really looking at wearables a year and a half, 2 years ago. I would say at first it was one of those things where like, this stuff's pretty cool. We need to try to find someplace to use this stuff, which I've heard today a lot, find the problem first, right, and then try to work wearables into it. And I think that's where we're at currently. As far as wearables below the neck, our main focus, I would say, is with ergonomics and how do we get data from the wearables, how do we use that data to find hotspots, and essentially to make the employee's job safer and less strenuous on them. We're also looking at it from a training perspective. I'm excited to see some of the technology that y'all have here. So that's kind of what I'm looking to take away and kind of where we're at as far as our division at Caterpillar.
Joe Williams with Rogers O'Brien Construction out of Dallas, Texas. We're a medium-sized contractor in Texas, and wearables really has a huge application in our industry. I'm sure many of you guys have driven by a construction site and have seen the things going on, but the way that I like to explain our industry to the people that aren't in it is it's like we work in a factory, but the factory changes every day. And so things are getting installed, moved, relocated. And so it's an environment for manufacturing that's very volatile and constantly changing. Also, everything we build is a prototype. The first time we build a design is also the last time we build that design. It's not very often that an owner comes to us and asks us to build the exact same product over and over again. And so we're constantly learning on our projects. And so where wearables play a really vital role is in digitizing kind of the last piece of the delivery process for us. We've done well over the last several years to digitize the things that are happening in the office, and it's getting that information to the worker in the field who's got a wrench in his hand. He's trying to make a decision right there on the spot about exactly what he needs to do, and that's where these devices have real application, is getting that information at the right moment, at the right time to that worker.
Cool. Thanks, Joe. And I think you touched on something interesting with recording the site as it's changing, using wearables for that. So I think you mentioned from when we spoke before that a lot of folks were using body-worn cameras, body-mounted cameras to actually record the site. And I know it's not always the most popular topic, but sometimes people don't like to be recorded or tracked while they're at work. And I think you had some sort of interesting insights around, getting construction workers and folks, boots on the ground to actually wear these devices. You had sort of said, well, this actually started long before we were doing wearables. It actually started with cell phone cameras and having folks walk around and, record the site with their cell phone cameras. So could you talk a little bit about sort of that progression through that acceptance process of, getting folks to buy into wearing the, body-worn cameras, recording devices, and maybe, did you have to meter your approach over time? Did you look at things like, only recording in specific intervals or during specific times? Could you walk us through some of that?
Yeah. So documentation, especially photographic documentation, has been a big part of our industry for a while. I mean, it's evolved over the years, as you said, and so we've gotten more comfortable with it over time, whereas maybe some of the other industries where cameras are a newer component into their workflow might be a little different. But from just traditional cameras, through to having specific digital cameras for our job sites, to then getting more powerful camera phones. Even recently in our industry, a big innovation is the use of drones and aerial imagery for monitoring our job sites from the sky. And so I think our people are being exposed more and more to this, kind of photographic documentation process. After we spoke, I actually kind of thought, and maybe one of the turning points was when they started seeing this data a lot more. We've been collecting it for years, but we're starting to use some software platforms that are allowing access to that those photographs more easily. And so they're seeing the photographs that are being taken by other members. And so initially, as I said to you, there was some concern about photographing something that happened that wasn't correct or that was bad, somebody getting caught doing something they weren't supposed to do. And so there was some initial resistance to just blanket capture of data on the job sites. And I think what helped overcome that was really was using that information for good. People seeing photographs that were taken, an example of something that we have an issue with is we've done all this work, we're building a hospital, and it's time to install the things inside the exam room, the sharps container, the grab bars, all the things that go inside of there, and we have to ask ourselves before we drill into the wall, is there a pipe behind this wall? Am I going to get sprayed with cold water or worse, some sort of medical gas when I drill into the wall? And when somebody can say, hey, does anyone have any photographs of this room and be able to call up that information and pull that up? I think it's those examples of using the data that's helped people adopt it, and it's helped us go from just specific capture to being able, as you said, with like body-worn cameras to do kind of complete capture, long-term exposure of images and that sort of thing. So.
And Kelvin, I know I think, had some interesting insights from General Electric's perspective as well. So I know you guys are looking at sort of a broad array of wearables for different functions. And you had sort of talked a little bit about, how you guys have approached sort of protecting employee privacy, some of the IT and legal concerns as well. I'm wondering if you could provide any additional kind of overlay on the subject.
Yeah, sure. environment, health, and safety being a compliance function, we sort of wanted to make sure we were playing by all the rest of the rules. So we have a close partnership with the data privacy team, with the labor relations team to really think through any of these wearables that we're deploying, what they're going to be tracking, who's going to have access to that data. And we try to open a very transparent dialogue with employees early on in that process. And really be quite collaborative about that. And while also, of course, talking about the benefits both to the employee and to overall managing our health and safety portfolio, because ultimately our goal here is to reduce injuries. So I think there's a lot of goodwill associated with that. That being said, there's definitely sort of a data privacy and a labor relations component to that in terms of getting folks to think about, how they too personally can benefit from some of these devices. So I think it's been a close partnership between us and the employees and engaging folks early, and frankly, not being afraid to say, we're gonna start really small in this space, and the device might have the ability to do more, but we're gonna start with something small and see if we can prove something out around that specific aspect of the technology. and see if it translates, in fact, to hazard reduction, and then go from there. And I think that's how we've begun to slowly start to bring employees into the fold. I also think that people just have a lot of excitement around the space generally, and I think since folks are getting more and more wearable technologies in their personal lives, I think that's helping the enterprise and the workplace adoption rates as well. But certainly it's been a partnership, and I think we probably terrify the lawyers when we come to them and say we're going to put this patch on people and it's going to monitor all this stuff, and but people are coming along, and I think we've been transparent about it and been upfront about it from the get-go and tried to really scope it small and see where we could get in a partnership manner.
Nice.
Hey, Mike.
No.
Can I add to that a little bit too?
Yeah, please.
We ran a couple pilots earlier this year, and we had some concerns, similar to what you're talking about. And to me, it wasn't as critical to have that employee's name on the device. So we went back and worked with the employee teams and said, it's more important we get the data to see where the hotspots are, right? And once we went back to them, once we collected the data and went back to the employees to show them, what we had and how we could use it, that really kind of turned their point of view on, okay, this could really work for us. It's pretty neat stuff. So going forward, it helped us out. So just keeping that open line of communication, I think, is critical. Nice. Just like you just said. So.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting as well. I think you guys all talked about data collection for the different use cases and some of the concerns there. But shifting gears a little bit, fundamentally communication can be a two-way activity. So it's not just pulling information from the wearable, from the user back to some data repository to do some analysis. It can also be pushing information to the wearer, to the user. And I think a couple of you had some really interesting insights there. So I know, Mark, you had mentioned sort of one of your main focuses was around sort of ergonomics and body movement of folks in the facility, and you're actually able to push feedback to the wearer of the device in real time as they're doing their work throughout the day. Could you comment a little bit about sort of how you approach that? Why did you see it as important to push data to the user rather than taking a more passive approach?
Sure. A couple things, I guess, in this space. We're working on a pilot currently with a wearable device that actually monitors employees' movements. So if they're bending over awkward or reaching or twisting, it'll essentially alert them that they're making that improper movement. This is kind of a bad analogy probably, but I compare it to a dog shock collar, right? If you have a dog and you're training your dog in the yard, right? As you get closer to that boundary, it vibrates, right? It beeps, 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 and then it shocks them. It doesn't shock the employees, but it does, it just vibrates, which is a simple thing, right? But it alerts them that, hey, I just made a bad movement. So you get that immediate feedback, and it's pretty neat. It's working pretty well for us. And that data, we go back and we share the actual data with them at a later time to show, hey, on this date, you were working this area, you had 25 awkward postures. What were you doing? So we can actually dig into it and see, hey, maybe we need to make some improvements in this area. So that's how we're using it currently, and it's been pretty successful for us.
Cool. And another one in terms of pushing communication to the wearer, I think Martin, really fascinating example. So I know you talked a little bit about the wearables you're doing with NASA. So you actually also have a feedback loop you're creating locally. So I guess you're wearing the device here where you actually have a little screen on there. So
right.
Could you talk a little bit about the sort of feedback loop you've created with the wearable?
Sure. So the feedback that we give here to astronauts is really limited. There is essentially two numbers. One is the cumulative dose, one is the dose rate which they're exposed to. I should say that in any spacecraft we have personal radiation monitoring, but we also have vehicle radiation monitoring. So those vehicle units are usually much more high fidelity, much more sophisticated instruments, and they give a whole lot more information to the crew than this little one. This little one is actually used for very accurately tracking how much exposure does an astronaut collect over a mission, and then at the end we can feed it into essentially the health record of the astronaut, and we can give the final value is a likelihood that any kind of pathogenic or any kind of sickness can result from the additional radiation exposure. That's kind of the final endpoint. But in terms of pushing back information to the astronauts, the next generation device where we want to include more sensors in it will have a much more comprehensive architecture to feed the information back to the ones that are actually collecting it. So I think for acceptance and buy-in, it's essential and critical to get the people on board who are going to collect the data and make them see actually that it's for their good, and they can they can take ownership in the data and even self-manage. So what we plan to do is to look into integrating accelerometry for sleep quality tracking, a microphone for noise exposure, and then astronauts can go to, say, a dashboard feature where they can pull all this information from and see, yesterday at that time I had a very high noise exposure, what did I do at that time? Was I in this area over there? So they can avoid that area, or they feel fatigued, they look at their sleep record, they see, that was not going so well, so let me try something different, I don't know, drink less before sleeping, I don't know what, but essentially giving them the ownership of the data is, I think, very beneficial for compliance, because astronauts sometimes forget on wearing those devices and then would have no data, so you want to make them interested in wearing it, and also creates a much better environment that it's less of a forced requirement that we put on them, but more like they contribute because it's for their own good. So I think those both sides are important.
Nice.
So I want to pick up on that a little bit. So healthcare is an interesting beast. How many of you, actually, if you had data displayed back to you, feel that it's your ownership to behave differently? So we all have probably a step counter somewhere. Do you actually look at it? Does that change your behavior? Do you feel that it's connected to your care? What if I gave you sleep data? What if I gave you your nutrition data, or that you're eating something? How much do you feel you'll take ownership of that, and how much do you feel that doctors should take ownership for your care? So I think this is one of the challenges right now in healthcare is, does that actually matter if I show it back to you? Are you going to behave differently? And how do we deliver that information? Or are we just giving alerts all the time and you become as alert fatigued as the nurses if you're in the hospital? Or the flip side of this is, how many of you wish your doctor saw all your Fitbit data and your heart rate monitor for every day of every moment and somebody was monitoring you? Well, is that really possible, feasible? How would a doctor even take that in with a panel of 500 or plus patients? Who's liable for that? So the data display back to whom and when and how actually in healthcare is going to be a really important challenge to overcome. Because if I show it back to you, are you motivated enough, aware enough, able to actually behave better and take care and manage your health better? Some people do, and in certain cases that you really see benefit for that. I think the majority of us, if we all have a Fitbit, how much have you changed your behavior besides, okay, I'll walk 100 more steps? Well, does that really make a difference in your life? Or are you really changing your sleep pattern? Or are you just hoping the doctor notices that you haven't been sleeping well and then calls you and says, hey, you should sleep? So these are some really complicated, because it's a dual user shared experience right now that I think we really have to think about. And I think the big part of that is people wanting to stream all their health data back to the doctor and almost imagine that they're going to watch you 24/7 and be every blip, know if that blip should be actionable and what to do with it. So how do we manage that, and what layer of analysis or expectations should we set in any legal requirements that come along that? Because we're building some of the infrastructure to enable that to happen. That a doctor can say, go take your blood pressure cuff. That data will be shown to me, but do you expect him to call you if it's going wrong, or are you supposed to just eat less salt? And will you stop eating salt, or sleep better? So these are the challenges that we're facing.
That's fascinating. And how do you manage that today? So I know when we spoke before, I know one of the things you spoke about was sort of looking at admitting the patient back to the home. So sort of, getting people out of hospitals back into an environment where they're comfortable, they're home, they're among family and friends, whatever it may be. But if patients are being discharged back to the home with a wearable, is there any sort of feedback loop currently, or is it more sort of a passive methodology?
Yeah, so I want to think about in rings of a few things. So first, I'll explain what he means by admitting somebody to their home. This is a pretty novel, cutting-edge thing that we're looking at Brigham, and we have a researcher really leading the charge on this. Right now, there's a research program where people come into the ER, come into the hospital, they actually get admitted fully to the hospital, but instead of having a bed at Brigham and Women's Hospital on 75 Francis Street in the tower, your bed, your hospital bed, is actually your bedroom. And we send you home with a set of equipment, some wearables, some body patches, some other equipment that is the right type for the disease that you have, your challenge. And then you have a level of nursing that is provided, and that doctor actually has a special backpack that he takes and does a home visit at certain increments and is monitoring you as a patient just as if you were being monitored in the hospital. So there's a whole host of reasons why you'd want to do that, right? We don't want, one, people with more severe conditions could have that bed because we're a top-level tertiary coronary care facility, but also being in the hospital can be risky as well. You can get sepsis and other diseases, so how can we push people into better settings for care? So that's a really unique thing that we're looking at. But healthcare as a system, we see primary care physician patients. Chronic conditions are a major problem, right? It's no longer come in, I broke my leg, set my ankle, do the surgery, basically weld me back up and send me on my way. We still do a lot of that, but the really cost to the system is people with asthma, COPD, diabetes, other chronic conditions, weight issues like that. So how do we help provide care to them? So there's a ring of, can we provide wearables to them and monitor or provide that real-time feedback so that they can better manage their care, medication adherence, other things like that. Monitoring, is your asthma condition getting worse and you should actually see a doctor because you might not know because it's a small change over time and you're using your peak flow meter. So there's that level. And then there's, in the hospital, is a different type of level of how are we monitoring. And there, wearables are a little less applicable there because we have pretty well censored rooms. There is an opportunity there for something as simple as monitoring ambulation post-surgery, pre and post-surgery. So if you have a surgery, the sooner you can get up and walk and move, the better your outcome probably is likely to have. So, but the thing is right now, how do you measure that without putting somebody in the room and watching if you walk? Versus right now, you might ask the patient, did you get up? Did you walk? Did you get up 6 times today? Did you walk down to the end of the hall? How many steps did you take? That's where a simple wearable could really start to help understand and help in care, start to change behavior and say, look, we're going to send a nurse in and get this person up and moving because after 6 hours, they haven't really moved and walked yet. So there's kind of 3 rings at least to that, okay, if not more.
Yeah, a lot of things to consider there. And I think, in terms of considerations and building requirements out, so when you guys actually set out to come up with a wearable strategy, you're going to use wearables to, improve safety and communication in the workplace. Where do you start? I mean, maybe also, on the other side of the panel with Joe, I'd love to just hear sort of like, as you get started with this, like how did you go about the requirements collection? Is it sort of, technology first, where you need to, collect some specific things, or are you really concerned about sort of the wearer? So, does the sort of ergonomics of the wearable come into play more so than the technology requirements? I'd just love to hear maybe from each of you how you approached it, how did you build out your requirements, and sort of how did you get started, essentially?
Yeah, I think as others have said before, a lot of what we've chosen to implement and been able to implement is a lot of consumer type devices or devices that were made for maybe a different purpose and kind of retooling them, for our specific needs. So some of it is analyzing what's possible, with a device or a system, and then saying where can this, have application. But to your point, in our particular instance, the technical requirements, typically drive the situation more so than ergonomics. As I've said to you guys on the phone, last week, that our guys are pretty uncomfortable most of the time, and clipping a camera on their pocket isn't going to cause them near as much discomfort as the other things that are going on in their job. But making it last all day, capturing high quality images, or being able to understand speech in a very loud environment, those kind of technical requirements typically drive our use case more so than ergonomics do.
Yeah, excuse me. For us, typically it starts, we've got about 60 locations, so I'm fortunate that they're always looking for new technology and some ways to make the workplace safer. So often they'll approach me or my team and say, hey, we've got this technology, check this out. We typically start small, we'll pilot it in one facility or 2, see how it works, and then move on to larger scale. Once we kind of prove it out larger scale, we'll usually typically offer it up to the whole division and say, hey, this stuff, we've been piloted 3 or 4 times, here's the data to support why it's a good thing. and leave it up to the other facilities to jump on board or not. And if it makes sense to do it as a division, we'll do that as well.
I would say for us, we take a bimodal approach to how we sort of set our wearable strategy. One is around, like I talked about earlier, taking a hazard approach, right? So our goal is to reduce employee injuries. We look at the places in which people are having the most significant injuries and go try to find tools, many of which are wearables and emerging technologies, to manage that hazard. So that's one, so sort of a problem-based approach, as we were talking about earlier in the day. I think the second is probably a technology-based approach, because we recognize that there are technologies out there, like the ergonomic wearable that we were speaking about a moment ago, that have significant productivity gains, right? So I can take a fuse sensor that the strong arm tech team has deployed, right? Put that on an employee, have them wear it for a day, a week, what have you, and that basically does their entire ergonomic assessment for the job that they're performing without any other person following them around with a clipboard, making a risk assessment, and then giving them either real-time feedback or feedback later, and then we stuff that in a drawer and maybe look at it once a year. So I think the productivity associated with some of these other devices that are coming out, for us, I think creates a bimodal approach to say, yeah, we're gonna look for things that are fit to the hazards we're trying to control to reduce employee exposure and injuries, but we're also gonna keep our eye broadly on the technology landscape and figure out what else is out there that's coming to market that we can either retool, adapt slightly, or just grab off the shelf and use for either productivity or some other benefit from an environment, health, and safety standpoint as well that might be driven more about what's available.
On our side at NASA, there's essentially two categories similar to your two categories, but they're a little different. So we have hazard requirements that we have to fulfill. Say we have to measure how much radiation an astronaut is exposed to. We have to measure how much noise an astronaut is exposed to, alerting them if it goes beyond a certain decibel level. And then there is another section which is open to improvement, which is pertaining to astronaut performance. The reason why we're so focused on this is that 1 hour of astronaut time costs an equivalent of about 6 weeks of an engineer on the ground. So you want to make sure that crew and astronauts do not waste their time on tasks that are repetitive, that are simple, that can be substituted with something else. And then we lose essentially a lot of taxpayers' money, because that's where NASA gets its funding from. And there's a large potential that we could supplement crew and astronaut work by data from wearables to increase their efficiency and their performance. So those two aspects kind of come first, and then it's a matter of, we're also getting into big data a little bit here. I think some previous panels and talks have touched upon this, and I want to propose a similar picture to cool but not useful, as in data but not useful. So everyone, or many people, get very excited these days about collecting data, but then you need to have some backend to it. You need to use it for something, you need to get something out of it. Only collecting data by itself doesn't do the job. So in our case, it's making the astronauts safe, enhancing their performance, and then seeing what technical requirements we impose on the hardware to get the sensor down to like the integration, the wearability, which is kind of the big main factor at the end before we start doing anything. What does it need to look, how does it need to look like to not impede astronauts in what they do, because that gets back to performance.
So at a hospital, like there's 1,000 cats. So we have researchers that act like cats in their own little thing, and clinicians act like cats, and so it's a little bit hard to be as strategic, I think. And right now in healthcare, I don't know how many people know what actually is useful. So we're doing a lot of work in a place, in a scenario where we can start to be the test bed to validate and verify that what signal within a heart rate monitor that's on your wrist actually matters. So there's one level of devices that are replicating what we already use now, blood pressure cuff, and making it wireless and at home, or a scale to tell weight monitoring. Those are kind of known, and and that fits that category. Some are moving to FDA cleared and having that level of regulatory requirement. There's a whole host of other wearables now that, I mean, if we measure your EEG or EKG for 24/7, do we all have an anomaly that happens every day? And then if so, should that be alarmed? So like there's a discovery period that I think healthcare is going through right now to understand that. And I think that's where our hospital is well suited to partner and pair with, vetting that out and testing, and seeing how that applies clinically. So there's just how do we use the sensors and the things that everyone's already using today, and is there relevant information that we can bring in and improve decision making, improve care, improve outcome, improve patient experience, and make it easier for the doctor. That's the 4 things we have to hit. The other part of this that we have is, and we built out a whole platform which now can integrate in wearables into this, is how do we do research better, right? So if you're going to test a drug, what outcome measure should your drug have? How can we measure that using activity? Is activity monitoring a better outcome measure for that drug than the scale that they use right now, which is a 10-question survey, or whatever it is? So can we use wearables to improve research so we understand a base condition better? Can we measure dehydration for frailty or something in a geriatric population? What can we measure to actually understand the basic physiology, biology, or condition better? And then, of course, we can move that towards translation to clinical care as well.
Nice. Thanks for that. Now, so we got all your perspectives sort of on kicking the tires, getting started, figuring out sort of what's next. Now, Martin, I got to ask, when you look at validation, I think most of the other panelists here, the use cases are, somewhat straightforward. Folks can sort of trial devices, do things. It can be very hands-on, interactive, all happen in real time. How do you approach this with a very remote application like astronauts in space? And how do you validate that the wearable is actually going to do what you intend it to do, that it's going to stand up to the elements and all that kind of stuff?
Right. So as you mentioned, astronauts are not, those that are deployed are not easily accessible. So you can't walk out the door and go to a different building. And there are thousands and thousands of miles somewhere in the vacuum of space. The other challenge is that environments in the vehicle are significantly different than what we can emulate on the ground. So for instance, the radiation environment on the ground that we are kind of surrounded by every day, or that exist in medical facilities, is significantly different to what's going on in outer space. Mostly it's hydrogen nuclei that make up most of the radiation. But those you have to go to dedicated accelerator facilities, and you get one single kind of energy sliver of that radiation spectrum, versus in space you have a continuous spectrum of many different energies. So we need to kind of define analogs, that's what it's coming down to verify our sensors, and then do essentially a tech demo mission where we rolled it up. This guy will fly next June on SpaceX 15 up to the ISS. We'll stay there for 30 days and come back down again. We'll collect our validation data, we'll analyze it, and then we hopefully can release it to operations. Another aspect that makes it difficult is that in outer space, if you're far enough away from the Earth, you're in microgravity or zero gravity, which means it not only means that everything will float up, such that putting a wearable on a lanyard won't help it because it will float in your face, but it's also a matter of moving air around. There's no convection anymore, so things heat up more quickly. So there's one thing to be said about thermal tolerances, but also moving air around on station or on any spacecraft, you have to make sure that, for instance, people don't sit in a CO2 bubble. If they have a longer task to sit somewhere to breathe in and out, the CO2 doesn't go anywhere, so it collects around your head and creates a bubble, and that can cause headaches, will impede your performance. So there's many, many things that make our job on that aspect particularly difficult. But what we can do is we create analogs for each kind of setting on its own as much as we can, and then do tech demos. That's essentially the process we apply.
Thanks. For Kelvin, I guess one other thing I was kind of curious about, so General Electric, huge company, tons of resources at your disposal. How do you approach, so when you're going to develop or deploy a wearable, what goes into that decision for your organization in terms of whether to source it from a startup or someone externally versus just build it yourself? How do you guys approach that type of problem?
We generally, at least in the below the neck wearable space, we generally look for folks in industry to partner with. There's so much going on in the space generally that I think that we look for folks who have a technology that's either maturing or just coming to market that have some applicability in an EHS space, and partner with those folks to run a pilot, deploy it inside GE. We certainly start small, as many others have said. And we find that we can make our resources go further doing a few different things in a small way, as opposed to significantly investing in one particular place, at least in the EHS space that we've been operating in. Because with so many hazards we're trying to manage and there's so much going on in the wearable space, I think as we've seen today and just throughout industry over the last couple of years, as more things come to market, we get the ability to sort of iterate and try different things. So that's really been our approach. Looking for what's going to be the best fit for this particular hazard or this particular area where we can drive some productivity into a process, and then iterate on that going forward, mostly with partners.
Now we've got about 5 minutes left for discussion because I know we do want to save some time for questions. So maybe I'll ask you guys, have everyone weigh in one last time. So maybe starting with Joe, any early failures, lessons, anything around ROI that you'd be able to kind of share just with the broader audience here?
Plenty of failures, for sure. We have a drawer of failures actually at the office of devices that haven't made the cut. And kind of picking up on the last topic, casting kind of a wide net is something that's helped us be somewhat successful, trying 2 or 3 different devices in a particular space. Especially when it's new or emerging, and then quickly giving up on something and moving on to the next thing. And for us sometimes that's around the hardware of the device, but a big part of the partnership for us is the people behind the technology. Sometimes we've partnered with people in the past where we just get a better sense from the people behind the hardware or the software. That their vision, they're going to really drive their vision towards getting it into the product, that they're going to be open to feedback and working with us and making small tweaks or changes. So that's led us to be successful in certain areas is that strong human kind of partnership behind the scenes. Just more examples of failure. I think rolling things out, too quickly, kind of declaring victory too early on things. Mark talked about, piloting, kind of refining the value and then deploying. That's been something that's been successul for us as well, and even creating, workflows and documentation around how to use new devices or hardwares to, before we roll them out and introduce them to people. So.
Yeah, for us, I think. What I learned, I guess, up front when we started this whole journey we would try things out, maybe not have a problem, right? It was just, this is kind of cool stuff. So we really didn't have a problem to associate it with. So I think now, as I look going forward, that's going to be my focus, and it should be our focus. We have a specific issue, whether it's ergonomics or improving our training, those types of things. Focus on those. I think that'll help us accelerate the process, not stray from going slow, pilot and like you just said, go slow, make sure it works and then move forward, but understanding the issues and using it appropriately, I think is the best we can do.
Yeah, I support all the comments that the two of you just made. The one thing I would add is one of the things that we try to use as a sort of continue on or pivot decision point is, are people using it? To me, that's the one fundamental question, are they using it? If they're not, then let's have a conversation about why not, or let's figure out, perhaps a different device or a different path forward, or maybe the tech's just not there yet, let's put it on ice for 6 months or so. But I think that for us has been a place where you get real honest with yourself real quick, right? Are people actually using this thing? And then make your decisions based on that. And sometimes that means you got to tweak what you're doing. But I think that to me, the adoption and the response from the field is critical.
On our side, I think we're only going to deploy the sensor on ISS in next June, so we're not that far along yet. Luckily for now, we haven't experienced any failures. Maybe something to contribute to the context here is at NASA, there's usually quite some effort going into new projects and new products or new technology. And so on this sensor, we have done a market survey, we have done a technology down select before we started to go into modifying an available COTS product per our requirements. So that kind of pedigree of the project gives us a little bit of a insurance, so to speak, to not run into any pitfalls that were obvious they're never obvious, but decrease the likelihood to run in any pitfalls that were not known from the start. In case there is any failure, I always want to point out that there is smart failure only allowed. So if something doesn't work, you have to get on that topic, see what didn't work out remedies, and then start again or go a different direction, but never let it just kind of discourage you, and always learn from what you experience. I think that's an important thing to remember.
I think for us, it's been infrastructure. So how do you create a space at the hospital with the right, and we learn this by hitting a lot of barriers and making mistakes along the way. How do you do a good, meaningful pilot? What does that mean? How can that exist in an electronic health record environment without breaking that? Or what's the guardrails you put on that? What security, IT, what ways can people plug in or not plug in? How does this get displayed out without changing? We have to care for 1.5 million covered lives in the partners healthcare system, not screw that up while we still have the ability to try to do digital innovation. So I think our team has spent a lot of time creating systems, processes, checklists, more from that infrastructure, access points, rules around that, to give the space to actually do some of these pilots, and then learning from some of the past pilots that how to make sure certain resources are in place so that if your thing now has a data thing that you want somebody to call up and say, hey, something's going on, you might need another nurse, another FTE nurse to be part of that study, and you can't just force that on the current nursing system because that's not in the current workflow, and they're still caring for patients. So these are some lessons learned, I think, mostly on infrastructure right now, that we're looking at how do we scale the ability to do this innovation in trials and pilots.
Thank you all. This has been really fantastic, really interesting discussion. I think we do have a few minutes for questions, so if there are any questions, certainly welcome those at this time.
So while we're waiting for somebody to ask one from the audience, can I ask you one? Is there something that you thought, and anybody can chime in, was an absolute lock, this was going to be a no-brainer, valuable, that just turned out to pan, it went flat for some reason, didn't have a use case, or flip it, one that you looked at that said, hey, I don't really see where this is going to fit, or is all that still emerging? Anybody have any examples like that? Kind of at the edges of the use cases. So you got the drawer of things that aren't being used.
Yeah, I won't say any names that are in the drawer. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to anyone about it afterwards. But no, nothing that's just been the no-brainer yet. I think we expected the heads-up display to be the no-brainer to your question, and it didn't go that way, the way that we thought it was going to. Mostly, I think that had a lot to do with the way that it had to be controlled, mostly by voice and in a loud environment. And so that was kind of an early failure for us on that. That's something that we thought was going to be extremely valuable and popular and didn't turn out to be.
Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got a couple here in the center.
Hi, so I'm Brian Statham from Life Booster. I think I've talked to you, Kelvin, before. I have actually a couple questions for Mark and Kelvin. With regards to adoption of these wearable technologies and just getting some use cases done, what have been sort of the barriers to adoption, if you are able to share that sort of information from the employee base? And then once you've had a pilot that's been successful and everything's groovy and you want to do a full deployment and scale the actual product, how are your teams looking to scale and actually utilize those products in the space? Is it a full-time, every single worker wearing it all the time, or are you looking at maybe periodically doing a couple assessments? Just curious about your thoughts on that.
Want me to start? Sure. We really, I guess as we approach the full scale portion of it, I don't think at this point have intent of putting the wearables on every employee in our rollout strategy. Ours will be somewhat of a rotation type process. We found that the unit we're using currently, it's more like wear it for a few months, then let it sit for a few months, and then wear it for 3 months. It's proven to be a little bit more successful for the pilots. So that's kind of the approach we're taking. As I roll it out to the larger number of facilities, for us it's been, we're kind of pushing it out and waiting for the pull to come back from the facilities. And we've been pretty fortunate. Most of the facilities are jumping on board because they see the value in it. And they see the benefit, the return they can get from it. So that's been positive so far. So I guess time will tell how many other of our facilities will jump on the bandwagon, but so far so good.
So I get to be the enforcer. So is there one other person who wants to chime in? Because we're coming up on our time.
Maybe one more thing to add to actually your question previously. In terms of complications that maybe show up on the way that are not expected maybe in the beginning, sometimes it's challenging to analyze data from a sensor that you get, where initially you think, oh great, you measure CO2 around a person's body, and you can get everything you want from that. You can reduce the concentration, and you move the person to a lower concentration area. But then, depending on where you put the sensor in the data, you might see spikes where either someone was close to you kind of breathing in the general direction, which you don't expect for some reason, and or otherwise you have your own breath on it if you look down on your clothing or something to adjust something. So not having a whole lot of data but only kind of one sensor poses challenges that sometimes are not foreseen. So it very much makes sense to have validation studies at first and analogs, for instance, like simulations of space stays like NASA has in the NEMO facility in Florida, where people spend a month on the water to simulate secluded environments. If you have them where the sensor's there, then you can already get some idea of
It's really got that experimentation and get started fast. So, Michael, great job on the panel. Thanks to the panel for their insights. We appreciate